In 1928, Catherine Donahue, a former factory worker, testified in court with a jaw that was literally disintegrating, her bones infected with radium, a result of years of painting watch faces with glow-in-the-dark paint. And this was just the beginning of a gruesome story that would expose the dark underbelly of industrial poisoning in America. The women who worked alongside Catherine, known as the Radium Girls, were mostly teenagers, some as young as 15, and they were employed by companies like the United States Radium Corporation and the Waterbury Clock Company, where they were tasked with painting the faces of watches and other instruments with a special glow-in-the-dark paint that contained radium. But here's where it gets dark. The companies knew that the paint was toxic, but they didn't warn the girls. And instead, they were encouraged to moisten their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium every day. And this practice would eventually lead to the girls' horrific deaths. The story begins in 1917, when hundreds of women were hired to work in factories in Orange, New Jersey, and Waterbury, Connecticut, and they were paid a decent wage, around 20 cents per watch face, which was a lot of money for women at the time. But the work came with a terrible cost, as the girls soon began to fall ill, suffering from anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would become known as radium jaw, and it was a painful and disfiguring disease that would eventually kill many of them. Nobody talks about this part, but the companies were aware of the dangers of radium as early as 1906, when a scientist named Marie Curie, who had discovered the element, warned about its toxic properties. But the companies chose to ignore these warnings, and instead, they continued to expose their workers to the deadly substance. And this reckless disregard for human life would eventually lead to a landmark lawsuit that would change the course of labor history. As the years went by, more and more girls began to fall ill, and it became clear that something was terribly wrong. But the companies refused to take responsibility, and instead, they tried to cover up the problem by telling the girls that they were suffering from syphilis or other diseases, and not from radium poisoning. And this is where everything fell apart, because the girls knew that they were being lied to, and they began to fight back, led by women like Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne, who became activists and advocates for workers' rights. And they started to organize and protest, demanding justice and compensation for their suffering. And this was a brave move, considering that the companies were powerful and well-connected, and they would stop at nothing to silence the girls. But here's the thing, the girls' struggle was not just about their own personal suffering. It was also about the broader issues of women's rights and labor history. Because they were fighting against a system that exploited and oppressed workers, particularly women, and they were demanding fair treatment, safe working conditions, and equal pay. And this was a radical idea at the time, especially in the context of the patriarchal society of the early 20th century. And the girls' activism would eventually inspire other workers to take action, leading to significant changes in labor laws and regulations. And this would have a lasting impact on the course of American history. And it's a story that's still relevant today, in the context of modern-day struggles for workers' rights and social justice. As the lawsuit against the United States Radium Corporation and the Waterbury Clock Company gained momentum, the girls' lawyers presented shocking evidence of the company's negligence and recklessness, including internal memos that showed that the companies had known about the dangers of radium since the early 1900s, and had chosen to ignore them. And this was a clear case of industrial poisoning, where the pursuit of profit had been put above human life. And the girls' lawyers argued that the companies had engaged in a deliberate cover-up, and that they had lied to the girls and to the public about the safety of the paint. And this was a damning indictment of the company's actions, and it would eventually lead to a major victory for the girls, and a significant shift in the way that companies treated their workers. And this is where the story takes a particularly dark turn, because as the girls waited for justice, they continued to suffer and die. And their deaths were often gruesome and painful, with some of them experiencing severe disfigurement, and others suffering from debilitating illnesses. And it was a terrible and tragic outcome, and one that could have been avoided if the companies had taken responsibility for their actions and had provided the girls with safe working conditions and proper protection. And this was a clear case of corporate negligence, and it would eventually lead to a major overhaul of labor laws and regulations, and a new era of accountability for companies that engaged in reckless and irresponsible behavior. The lawsuit finally came to a head in 1928, when Catherine Donahue and 4 other former factory workers testified in court. And their testimony was devastating, as they described the horrific conditions they had faced, and the terrible suffering they had endured. And the court was shocked by their stories. And the companies were eventually forced to pay out significant damages. And this was a major victory for the girls, and a significant milestone in the struggle for workers' rights. And it would have a lasting impact on the course of American history. And it's a story that's still remembered today, as a testament to the bravery and resilience of the Radium Girls, and their fight for justice in the face of overwhelming odds. The aftermath of the lawsuit was significant, as it led to a major shift in the way that companies treated their workers. And it resulted in significant changes to labor laws and regulations. And it also led to a greater awareness of the dangers of nuclear accidents, and the importance of protecting workers from industrial poisoning. And this was a major legacy of the Radium Girls, and one that would continue to inspire and motivate workers and activists for generations to come. And it's a story that's still relevant today, in the context of modern-day struggles for workers' rights and social justice. And it's a reminder that the struggle for justice and equality is never truly won, but it's always worth fighting for. In the end, the story of the Radium Girls is one of tragedy and triumph, of suffering and resilience, and it's a testament to the power of the human spirit, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And it's a story that will continue to inspire and motivate us as we struggle for justice and equality in our own time. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe for more stories like this.